Thank you very much for this kind thinking and the state of the Islamosphere. I suppose the way to start would be to reflect upon what is it that we mean by critical thinking. Now, it's quite clear that you can't easily imagine someone saying, I am an uncritical thinker. It doesn't make much sense. So, to some extent, all thinking should be critical. It is a human failing characteristic that we often find the thinking of the people that we disagree with to be uncritical. So when we ask that we need critical thinking, one way of thinking about this thinking would be that what we are saying is this: we want reflections which are different than the reflections of those who we disagree with. So in that sense, critical thinking is really only possible in the context of a disagreement, of an intellectual, cultural, or political disagreement. So critical thought always involves a disagreement. But it's not any kind of disagreement. One of the ways that critical thought allies itself with critical theory, that it is a disagreement with the present state of affairs. So critical thought, critical thinking are always positioning themselves as reflections which dispute the present, that dispute how things are arranged today. Now, clearly, in the case of the Muslim Ummah, there is a very strong sense of what constitutes the fabric of Muslim life today. One way to think of this would be in relation to the impact of colonialism. Now, it is true that at the height of the colonial world order centered on Europe, perhaps three major Muslim political societies were not under colonial rule. The governments of Persia and perhaps to some extent Afghanistan. Now, there have been maybe other smaller political societies scattered around the world, but among the significant ones, it was the case there were only three sovereign or independent Muslim entities. At that time, at the turn of the 20th century, perhaps up to 80% of Muslims lived under European colonial rule, or if you prefer, Western under colonial rule, from the Philippines to parts of Africa and further beyond. From the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, all these oceans where there were Muslim communities, they were under Western colonial rule. And this colonial rule was not just simply socio-economic. It wasn't simply the plundering of resources and income and blood and treasure. It was also epistemological. In other words, that was also an order of the mind. It helped shape the thinking of people throughout this planet. Those who were colonized as much as those who colonizes. Now, this epistemological aspect of colonialism has been neglected in favor of considerations looking at the military, political, socio-economic aspects of colonialism. And the difficulty with that is that even though one could argue that formal colonialism has come to an end for the most part, epistemological elements of colonialism has continued. In other words, the countries may have become formally independent, but it's not the case that the intellectual or kind of mental of subjugated colonized populations have them necessarily been also decolonized. Reflecting on the sort of independent Muslim political societies, along with other independent countries which received their independence from the European colonial order, it is hard not to conclude that the process of decolonization is incomplete. What has been decolonized is very limited, perhaps at the level of political independence, ability to represent countries in international forums, have currencies which are perhaps independent. More or less, there is no formal colonial rule, but it would be wrong to conclude that there has been independence at the level of reflection or thinking. That in most countries, coloniality continues epistemologically. Therefore, the task of any critical thought must be to be involved in the process of decolonizing, to deepen decolonization. And this is true of Muslim thinkers as well as non-Muslim thinkers. The need for decolonization is urgent, and it is hard to imagine in this day and age what could critical thought be which wasn't also decolonial. What does it mean to think decolonially? To address this question, I think it's important to recognize the three major zones in which Muslimness is performed. Firstly, and most obviously, it is the zone of Muslimstan. That is societies which are populated by overwhelming number of Muslims, which identify themselves or their cultural practice in some shape, way, or form as being framed by the experience of Islam. And while they may have large groups or minorities or the leadership of these countries or elites who find the identification with Islam problematic or embarrassing, it remains the case that most of those societies are in some way engaged with the project of Muslimness and continue to do so, at least at a cultural, everyday, ordinary level. The second main theater where Muslimness is performed is what is described as post-national. And what I mean here by post-national is a recognition that the nation state, the countries that we live in, are not timeless, but historical. And what happened in these countries, Muslimness is as old as the contemporary formation of these countries' political communities and societies. So that the Muslim presence predates the early modern formation of these states and countries. Now, in many cases, for example, there is an attempt to articulate a continuity to India, which goes beyond the Muslim presence. But again, the Indian Republic was founded in 1947. There are these mythologies of a deep past are exactly that, often state-led mythologies. But in the practicality, you're talking about a Muslim presence which may be many, many hundreds of years long in the areas which became independent states, were there before there were countries. And I think that's important to mention that as a distinct form of what Muslimness is. So in some cases, Muslimness becomes completely banalized, that it doesn't have this to it. It is just considered to be a part of life, something ongoing. The third area is post-colonial, and this is the area in which Muslimness is expressed mainly as a form of immigration, of recent arrivals. And many of these countries, a Muslim and an immigrant and a refugee are considered to be synonymous. A Muslim is someone who has arrived as the European colonial empires collapsed for the most part, and these societies conceive of themselves as being without Muslims before and now have become overrun in some places by the Muslim presence. Again, I'm talking not about the reality of the situation, or I'm talking about how the perceptions of Muslimness are generated in those areas. So if you think that these are the three major areas around which how Muslims are staged, then you can imagine that what it means to be a Muslim is different in those cases. It has different connotations. But more importantly, the challenges and difficulties that the performance of Muslimness faces are also going to be radically different. So think critically, to think decolonially in these contexts may not be exactly the same, because the agency of Muslim suffering may be varied. So there's a sense in which it's important for any critical thinking to recognize the different spaces in which Muslimness is performed, and therefore the different spaces in which Muslimness is disciplined and regulated. Okay, so if this is the kind of broader context around Muslim suffering, what is it that we want critical thinking to do? What is critical thinking in this context? Now, I don't or the ability to speak about all forms of critical thinking. As I said before, I think people who are critical thinkers are the ones that I happen to agree with, and the ones I disagree with, I probably think are not critical enough. But that's just the way things are. What I do want to talk about as a form of critical thinking, which is specific to the challenges the Islamosphere faces, is critical thinking as an embodiment of critical Muslim studies. Now, critical Muslim studies is a multidimensional project which has been going on for about 5 years, which partly or mainly is an academic endeavor, but it has consequences which seep into general society itself. Now, there are 4 elements to critical Muslim studies, which I want to say, or at least perhaps introduce at this point in time. Firstly, there is the question of the critique of Eurocentricism. Critical Muslim studies is based upon a recognition of the critique of Eurocentricism. And it's important that we understand what Eurocentricism is. Eurocentricism is not simply anything to do with Europe. Eurocentricism is an epistemological rather than a geographical or cultural or historical category. Eurocentricism is about how you produce knowledge by reference to a particular reading of Europeanness, rather than Eurocentricism being about Europe itself. I think, again, it's important to maintain that distinction. The second to draw attention to is the suspicion of positivism. Now, positivism is simply, the way I'm using it here, is to understand it as a belief that there are ways of understanding the world which are purely scientific, neutral, and transparent, which tell us how things really are. It's modeled on the idea that the humanities and social sciences should try and imitate the natural sciences, and it simply seems to argue for the possibility of objective, predictable knowledge which would allow us to intervene in the world today. The reason why I'm suspicious of positivism is because positivist thinking often assumes a dehistorical understanding of knowledge. In other words, positivism denies historicity. So instead of thinking that we have come to a particular way of constructing knowledge, positivism believes that the construction of knowledge responds not so much to human needs in a particular way, is somehow universal and neutral. Now, this becomes a bit clearer when you look at the third thing that I want to mention, which is the significance of Orientalism. I'm hoping that everyone here knows about the critique of Orientalism launched by Edward Said, but I want to say why this is so fundamental to critical Muslim studies. One of the things that Orientalism did as a book was that it allowed us to see the production of knowledge about the non-European societies was based on deep-seated assumptions which reflected particular kind of interests and epistemological commitments of Europe. So what Orientalism does is argue, uncertainly sometimes, but with a degree of passion, that the knowledge constructed of the Orient, and the Orient here is not a geographical category, it's a residual category, it's simply the rest of the world rather than the West, was imbricated with the exercise of power. And why this is important is because Orientalism wasn't something that simply ended with colonialism. Orientalism enabled colonialism in the first place, but Orientalism continues to enable coloniality. Orientalism is a barrier to decolonization because most, let's talk about Muslims, who are in positions of authority, positions of decision making, whether it's in a public office or in the private sector, often understand themselves, their societies, Islamicate through the prism of Orientalism. And it is Orientalism which is so deeply ingrained that it leads Muslim scholars, and I mean people of good faith, not just mercenaries or people who have no sort of commitment to a better world, to understand the challenges they face as a failure of piety or a failure of progress, a cultural failure of Muslim societies, rather than a recognition of the political challenges that Muslim societies face. In other words, cultural problems are seen as being the real problems rather than political problems. The final point about critical thinking that I want to talk about is that it embraces post-colonial and decolonial thinking. And from what I've said, it should be very obvious why it does that. But at the heart of this is the idea that colonialism was an epistemological project as much as a socio-economic project, and therefore it cannot be undone. Decolonization cannot be deepened unless there is an effort for epistemological delinking, an effort for epistemic disobedience, an effort for epistemological emancipation. And that is one of the key things that critical thinking can do in this context. So if you ask me what critical thinking is against, because critical thinking has to be against, what is the shape of the present that the critical thinking is against, then the shape of the present that the critical thinking is against is the inheritance and continuity of racial ordering of the world. That is what decolonization is against, and some decolonizing impulse, those who need to be decolonized, are Muslims as much as anyone else. Okay, so how to do this? In the time remaining, and I just want to flesh out a few thoughts around the articulation between the decolonial and the critical, and the decolonial and the Islamicate. So on the one hand, I've been making this argument in this presentation that to be truly critical in this day and age means to be decolonial. Now, the argument that I want to make in the next part of my presentation is about the links between the decolonial and the Islamicate. Some people may argue that, well, you know, Islam and Muslims have got nothing to do with the decolonial. Islam is before decoloniality. There is nothing that the question of decoloniality does. It brings something which is secular into the field of Islam. And what we need is to focus on the religious element of Islam, because if you have good Muslims, you will inevitably have good Muslim societies. And therefore, the way to get a good Muslim societies, which seems obvious, is to work upon individual good Muslims. Now, here's the paradox. Often people talk about critical Muslim studies or decoloniality of the Islamicate by arguing or suggesting that, look, this is really secularization. This is another aspect of westernization. What we need is something which is authentically Islamic. We need Islamic solutions to Muslim problems. But the problems are not Muslim problems. The problems are around Muslims. The problems are inflicted upon Muslims, but they're not necessarily Muslim problems. But more importantly, this line of thinking demonstrates the perniciousness of Eurocentrism and why it is important to challenge. Let's start off with the idea of secularism. Now, you can't talk about secularism without having a category of religion. So when people accuse others of trying to secularize Islam by talking about decolonization, what they're doing is admitting that there is something called secular and there's something called religion, and Islam is a religion. Therefore, anything which is not religious is not focusing on Islam. Of course, religion is not an Islamic category. To give you a very simple illustration of this is that the first English translations of the Quran translated deen not as religion, but as sacred law. Now, you can turn around and say, well, it doesn't really matter how they translated it. Deen was always religion. Well, that's not true either, because it is because of the category of religion, which is patterned on certain Enlightenment reading of aspects of Christianity, which determines what religion is. As a consequence, what other traditions, customs, norms, practices which labor under the term religion become defective religions, second-hand religions, which need to be shaped and reshaped to make them accord with Christianity. So what you have is a kind of smuggling in of an implicit Christianization of the Islamicate, Christianization of Judaism, Christianization of Hinduism, and at a level, at a conceptual level, that because what is deemed to be religious is deemed to be Christian, and therefore, if these traditions and these customs are to be understood as religious, they have to reshape themselves to fit this Christian-shaped whole that is religion. So that's one aspect of that. And what this means is those who talk about secularization through decoloniality are simply repeating the inheritance of the colonizer. They are repeating the logic of the colonizer, which tried to remove the Islamicate from the public sphere, from considerations as a way of life, and confined it into the private sphere, confined it as a religion that it could regulate and control. Okay. Now, I think it's really, really important that we try and understand that critical thinking involves us in moving away from the everyday presentations to thinking about strong questions, questions which do not simply depend on taking for granted the set of assumptions which are already in play, but thinking about how those questions are formulated rather than thinking that these questions reflect only the current natural challenges that are present. So what I would like to say, how do we think critically? One aspect of thinking critically would be, in the case of Muslims, is to recover a greater understanding of Muslim history. I have made this point many, many times, but it seems to me that it is true that despite what our learned members of our learned members of our community may think, and why of people of a certain generation may often think that Muslims do not know enough about their religion, they don't know enough about their faith. Muslims know less about their history. The history of the Islamicate enterprise is unknown for the most part, except that sort of canonical period around the Prophet and his companions. So if you go to any classroom, you go to any kind of community, and you ask them to name 10 famous Muslims who were not companions, we can imagine it will come to a very, very similar list. So I think that's the first element I would want to say. The second, I think, is really to try and understand that the concepts that we have, the concepts that we are using, reflect. It doesn't necessarily need to be abandoned in the hunt for authentic Islamic concepts, as I've said before, but we need to recognize their historicity of them, and therefore think about the work they can do and the work they cannot. That, I think, is an important of critical thinking. Don't just apply a rule, invent a rule. Think about how that application of that rule may itself be a problem. The final point that I want to make really is around the issue, as I said before, critical thinking has an opportunity now to be part of the conversation that. And let me end with this thought. The world that we live in was made by colonialism. It all down to the maps that we use, the language that we speak, the food that we eat. All of these were made possible by colonialism. And colonialism also made the West, or Europe, the center of human destiny. Not only was it the center economically, politically, militarily, etc., it was also considered to be the center in terms of how the future will unfold. Westernization was the destiny of every nation. And project that Muslims will become westernized over time. And that was a real thing. For reasons which are complicated, I would suggest to you we are living at the beginning of the post-Western age, in which the West has been decentered, but it has not been replaced. So part of critical thinking for Muslims and non-Muslims, for those who identify themselves as Europeans and those who do not, those who are committed to a better future must also recognize that the post-Western has an epistemological footprint, that so many of our thoughts, so many of our analytical categories were wrapped up in extrapolations of history. The post-Western makes it more and more difficult for us to use Western categories to comprehend a world which can no longer be shaped or made where there is no longer European colonial power that makes true European colonial knowledge. In that tension, there is a space of critical reflection and creativity. To understand the post-Western requires us to think anew, to think critically. And for the Islamosphere, for Muslim scholars, for Muslim activists, for Muslim thinkers, whether they are working in the academy or they're working outside the academy, those who want to reflect and want why there is Muslim suffering, but what can be done about it. For them, it becomes important that we expand the horizon of the post-Western and embrace its possibilities. That is the project of critical to contribute to the expansion of the post-Western and investigation of its possibilities. It is a project of epistemic emancipation. So only by epistemic emancipation can we reflect upon what are the interventions that are needed in a new world that Muslims and others all can fit in. Thank you.